Shortly after 9/11, hundreds of Arab, South Asian, and Muslim men began disappearing off the streets of New York and New Jersey. And when I say disappearing, I mean really, their friends, their family, couldn't find them, had no idea where they went, thought perhaps they died at the World Trade Center. We later learned that they had been arrested in connection to the 9/11 investigation. And what we learned is that as tips started rolling in across the country from sort of the frightened citizenry, tips like, my neighbor's Arab and he keeps strange hours, I think he might be a terrorist. If during that investigation they encountered any individual who was here in violation of the immigration law, had overstayed his visa, maybe was working without a visa, civil immigration violations. If they encountered anyone who fit that profile, that individual was arrested and held in connection to the terrorism investigation. I think 9/11 was a moment when the public and the courts began accepting a completely two-tiered system of justice in this country. If you are vulnerable to arrest and detention by virtue of your immigration status, then you don't have the same constitutional protections as citizens in this country. It was a moment when it became acceptable to suspect huge groups of people based on where they come from and treat them differently than others.
So as I was producing this story, I was supposed to speak to one of those men. He was picked up, but never found to have a connection to terrorism and ultimately deported back to a Middle Eastern country. It was the same week the United States was working to evacuate tens of thousands from Afghanistan after the Taliban takeover, signifying the end of America's longest war that started because of the 2001 attacks. But the day we were scheduled to speak, the man canceled, concerned for his safety with everything going on. It underscored that 20 years later, there's still fear about speaking up or out against what happened in the days following 9/11.
Not a single of the detainees was found to be connected to terrorism. Not a single detainee was found to have any connection to 9/11. And it's really not surprising that this is the case given the manner in which they were arrested. None of them were arrested as a result of a legitimate law enforcement suspicion. These are all people who came to the attention of the government through citizen tips based on stereotypical notions of, Arabs being dangerous, Muslims being likely terrorists in the wake of 9/11.
Rachel Meeropol is a senior attorney for the Center for Constitutional Rights. And believe it or not, a lawsuit she filed addressing how Middle Eastern immigrants were treated during their detention after 9/11 today only has a partial verdict. The Supreme Court's ruled on parts, but other parts are still being reviewed by judges in the Eastern District of New York. After all this time working on this case, Rachel wonders if the biggest change in immigration since 9/11 is, if you are an immigrant, are you guilty until proven innocent? Detained immigrants' struggle with this question was shown in art and written about in letters, produced not just at the Metropolitan Detention Center in New York, but other federal prisons and Guantanamo Bay, Cuba. Many inmates said it was how they made it through years, in some cases more than 10, of detention, only to be released with no connection to terrorism or 9/11.
The lawsuit claimed that really what was happening was an end run around the constitutional protections that individuals in this country are guaranteed when they are suspected of criminal activity. When an individual is arrested for a suspected crime, of course, there must be probable cause that they have committed the crime. They are promptly brought before a neutral judge for a determination of probable cause. There's the question of whether they can be detained versus released on bail. They have a right to a speedy trial. They have the right to an attorney to represent them. None of these protections exist in the same way when an individual is arrested for a suspected immigration violation. So holding the 9/11 detainees for immigration violations, when in reality, the purpose of their detention was to hold them, to investigate them for criminal activity, is a complete end run around the Constitution. And the Center for Constitutional Rights lawsuit challenged that as a denial of due process, a denial of equal protection based on the fact that Muslims, Arabs, and South Asians were being singled out for this treatment.
Rachel argues this distinction, or in her words, misuse, of the criminal and immigration laws introduced a flexible legal atmosphere that set the stage for other immigration changes since 9/11. Most recently, former President Trump instituted a travel ban to some Muslim countries. At the southern border, the Stay in Mexico initiative prohibited asylum seekers from crossing the border. And now, responding to the pandemic, the Biden administration said it will rapidly deport families from the border using a public health law.
I think what we now see is a massive tightening of the borders, constant equation of sort of non-citizens and immigrants as potentially dangerous individuals. But of course, that's not true of all immigrants. That's true of immigrants of color. It's, there has been no change in the way we treat white immigrants. So we do see these two categories, immigration at the southern border and sort of looking at immigrants from the Middle East. What happened after 9/11 and the lens of suspicion that was cast on these groups of people has continued and I think has spread to what we now see at the southern border. But of course that has to be completely differentiated from the way we treat sort of white immigration in this country.
In the case supporting the 9/11 detainees, the Center for Constitutional Rights attempted to hold federal officials who ordered or instituted these measures financially responsible for their actions. They argued plaintiffs deserved it and said they wanted to deter any federal officials from denying constitutional rights under the cover of immigration law going forward. The Supreme Court ruled that senior-level federal officials were insulated from having to compensate an alleged victim. But lower courts have yet to decide if federal prison workers could be held responsible.
Yeah, I'm angry. I went to law school thinking of our system as one where you could fight for justice, not thinking that justice was guaranteed by any stretch. But I didn't understand going in, and I don't know that many even lawyers do, that when federal government officials, high-ranking federal government officials, violate clearly established law, they cannot be held accountable. In my mind, there is no logic to that proposition in a functioning democracy. And that change in the law, that winnowing of individuals' opportunities to seek compensation and accountability from the highest levels of government, that has happened in the last 20 years. That's happened on my watch, and in a case I've struggled to push forward for 20 years. So I'm angry about that. It needs to be changed.